Welcome to the Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. As you know, the Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire, generating new technologies for wildfire suppression and containment, something that we certainly know is of concern all around the world, especially in Canada, where we saw some of the worst fires in the last few years. Canada, the country that can't keep its smoke to itself. Well, we have a representative here. We have Chopik, who's joining us from Toronto. And Chris is one of the better known wildfire experts, not only in terms of reduction of wildfire incidents, reduction of wildfire impact on houses, specific things you can do to keep your house from burning down, minimize the risk of it happening, I should say. And of course, the impact on real estate of wildfire. You buy a beautiful house looking over the mountains. Now you're looking at a burn scar. Good luck selling the house. And likewise, if your house becomes uninsurable, not the easiest thing to sell. So there's deep real estate impacts. And there's also these allied risks, how it affects, water quality, et cetera, et cetera. So Chris, welcome to the Fire Break. How are you today?
Thanks, Steve. It's terrific to be here and look forward to having a good conversation with you.
Well, I found that I can import wisdom to the United States from Canada, and there's no tariff on it.
Amazing! Wow, how did we get through that thin 49th parallel?
Right. That's actually the most valuable thing we can import from anywhere.
Amazing. Yeah,
and
that's a good perspective. Yeah.
So tell me what you're working on these days and how you came to be working on it.
Yeah. So I guess the things that I find most interesting right now are the questions of housing supply and housing security as they intersect with all kinds of natural hazard risk, including wildfire. Wildfire is, as you point out, very acute. It has a distributed impact, so it's not just the individual whose home is affected or whose community is affected, but it is something that, I don't know, I was on the phone with somebody from the city of Calgary last year during wildfire season, and all of the rep soccer for the weekend was canceled. So, she's wondering what to do with her kids who are playing sports outside now that they can't play outside. So nice. These kinds of impacts are really quite far reaching, but acutely, I see a undermeasured trend around the loss of housing units and the impact to housing supply, and then the impact to housing security amongst populations. What does that look like? Well, in Canada last year, we had $8.5 billion worth of insured losses. And those are just the dollars that insurance companies paid out against.
Right, not a tree in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
A house that has an insurance policy or a business.
That's right. And not an uninsured property that, that burned. So it doesn't measure any of that. It doesn't measure any of the costs associated with that are not paid for by insurance. So, if you're living in a hotel room with your two kids and one queen bed and mom and dad in the other, you're probably going to skip the dishes more frequently than you would otherwise. And those costs are not part of, the costs that are calculated in insured losses. All the knock-on impacts to quality of life and cost of living that come from living in a hotel room for 2 years, if you're well insured and your house gets built back, those kinds of implications have impacts to quality of life, health, ability to earn. So economic productivity at a household level, there's all sorts of knock-ons. But the acute sort of starting point that I think of is that individual economic productivity begins with housing. So your ability to contribute productively to any economy starts with having a place to live. And if your house is burned down, if your community is burned and displaced, your place of work may have also been lost in the fire. And now you're looking at a burned out shell of what used to be your building and your community. And so all of the social structure, as well as the house itself, are entwined in that experience, but acutely and very measurably and almost linearly that $8.5 billion. If we imagine that each house that is completely decimated is worth $500,000, if that's the economic assumption we use, that means that 17,000 houses in Canada were lost to natural hazard in 2024. That's a lot of families. That's 17,000 families now who are pressing against an already a tight housing market without a place to live until they get to a return period, until that 2-year period or so when the house gets built back and they can move back in happens. And so are we measuring that? And, GDP would say, hey, we got $17,000, $8.5 billion of cash injection to our economy as measured by GDP. It looks
because of the new houses, and
it looks like a
other
positive
expenses.
GDP spend. But are we measuring fulsomely the added pressure on existing housing supplies? That is, how does it affect pricing of rental and market housing, when those families have to go and find a place to live? So in a small community, and the example I use is actually near Halifax, there were 200 houses burnt in a wildfire in 2023. That's 200 houses in a small community where mom and dad work there and kids go to school there. And so you desire to stay in a community, but it's an already tight housing marketplace. And where do people go? So after all the hotel rooms are gone and all the Airbnbs are booked and all the brother-in-law couches in the basement apartments and all of the other forms of housing that are accessible, that is a very pressed marketplace where probably there's price escalation. So it's a compounding impact to economic productivity and housing availability and housing affordability. And so the reason to act in protecting property is not just because it's my largest asset, not just because I have half of my retirement savings stored in that object, but it's also that from a societal perspective, we have a lack of economic productivity that happens in the course of actors in our societies, just getting back to where they were 2 years ago, having suffered a catastrophic loss event.
So the impacts being, really kind of beyond measurable, bring you back to the best case would be we don't lose these houses, right? And we implement known practices,
right,
for stopping that way. And that's actually the simplest part of it, right? Because a home burning is simply a physics and chemistry issue, that, it's a thing problem. It's not economics, and, or we used to call voodoo economics, which is probably still a good term. It's just, remove the thing from the source of ignition, remove the fuel chain between the source of ignition and the one, right? And don't build your house out of fuel.
That's a key ingredient, and it intersects a whole bunch of other things that are going on, like getting to net zero, which we do with foam. So, you do the right thing and you put a non-ignition roof and a non-ignition siding on, but the embers get in behind that wet wall, and there's XPS foam insulation, which is definitely going to melt and become fuel in that 400-degree proximity heat of that wildfire. And so how do you think about the house and your asset renewal in order to reduce risk? And I think importantly, why communities and municipalities should think about this together, not just, it's not just you and I acting, but it's you and I with our neighbors and maybe our, community council member, or, at a parish level in the United States, where you really are reducing the risk, for everyone at the same time, progressively improving over time. So let me break that down. First, in a community, you're really only as strong as your weakest link. And so, and sea level and storm inundation from the ocean is really easy to see on this. If I put a seawall in Miami, I put a seawall in front of my property to ensure that king tide does not, wipe out my living room. If my neighbors don't do that too, then the wave is coming around, and fire is no different. And so,
Yeah.
Jasper, BC, which is, or Jasper, Alberta, was burned out in extreme fire last summer in Canada. And Jasper is a place that everyone goes, every family trip in a station wagon or SUV that across Canada to see the country, you stop there and you go on a hike in the mountains and you see the glaciers, and it is part of sort of societal memory. I don't know, like the Eiffel Tower would be in France. And but Jasper was a fire smart community. They were one of the most advanced sort of fuel control in the perimeter of town, and a high uptake of fire smart adaptations at a household level in community, and still half the community burned, and lots of people were displaced. So, what does that do to Jasper? Well, first of all, when your residents are there, you're probably not charging them taxes. Then you've got to reinvest in ensuring that the services are restored to those lots. And then the build back begins. And so there's a lot of time where a municipality isn't getting tax revenue from those property owners and has to
or from tourism, right?
Or tourism. And in that case, there's massive tourism, but it could be like, whether it's industry or tourism, whatever the economic drivers, they are also probably on fire. So your workers have been displaced from home, and your facilities potentially have been affected by that wildfire. So this is where I think the community, the intersectional, the shared value of investment is with the municipality who reduces risk, potential reduction in insurance costs at a community scale for urban assets that are owned by the city, as well as individuals. So, we get to save it all by working together. At a household level, what happens is, houses need repair. Like, I need a new roof. Now, I have a cedar shake roof, and I'm in a wildfire context.
Yike.
I got matches on the roof. Great.
Yeah.
So that's a really high demand aesthetic. Houses that have that will get paid more in a resale housing market because of that aesthetic. However, what if you can't get insurance after you get your house because you've got that roofing on? So at the point of asset renewal is a great time for homeowners to consider what they might do differently. And whether that's, I'm going to build a fiber composite deck instead of a wood deck, so it's lower ignition. Whether that means I'm going to put a non-cedar shake roof on in a wildfire context, and I'm going to go for something that is low ignition, whether it's really high quality shingles, which aren't my preferred solution, but it's one of the solutions. Or I'm going to be going for something like steel, where I can, have a lower ignition probability.
Or tile.
Tile's good too. And so all of these choices, which may look like they're a premium cost choice today, are probably the right thing to do at an individual household level and at a community level. I think of it kind of like credit ratings. Regions and municipalities have credit ratings. They get bonds to invest in their infrastructure from investors, and so what do you do with that investment? What do you do with that credit rating? It allows you to leverage for a better future. It seems to me that the winning communities of the future, the places I want to move, are places that are going to be, thinking about community scale resilience as well as a residential, it's not only like, it's almost like a school district or a crime rate in a neighborhood.
Yeah.
This is a stigma that the real estate industry is used to. And so when you think of the value of property, the better the school, the higher value of the property. The lower the crime rate, the higher value of the property. Maybe the future is the lower the probability of ignition from wildfire, then the more preserved my value, the lower cost of insurance, and maybe safer my family is. So all of those things, I think, accumulate to good value for investing in resilience. And
I saw KB Homes is counting on that. I saw an ad on LinkedIn the other day, and they said, featuring whatever neighborhood, the country's first, fully wildfire compliant neighborhood.
Yeah.
Where all the homes were built to a standard The community itself was isolated from nearby vegetation by 50-meter zone, and common
Yeah.
spaces were
And
properly
even
maintained.
this the travel speed and spread of the fire is changing, right?
Yeah,
The wind conditions, the airborne embers, and the traversing in Kelowna, they traverse the lake. Like
yeah, right.
that's a flying piece of fire. It's absolutely essential that if you've got a fountain of cigarette butts landing on your roof, that
Yep,
none of them can start a fire. Like that's just, we want to put yourself in that situation and be there
right.
and protect your asset.
Fort McMurray came across the lake, right?
That's
That's
right. Yeah.
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 We
And so
can.
even the speed of travel, how hot it is inside the hot fire, because the fire is a little hotter than it used to be, a little more drought makes, that the fuel conditions really solid for creating a hot column of rising air that is capable of carrying those embers higher, and then therefore they travel further and the spread of fire is faster. So when those embers land, putting them in a place where they're not going to burn everything down is really
Right.
important. It's an essential ingredient. And if you take any example, the first house is next to the second house, and so the ignition point, just like the seawall example, right?
Yeah.
If you don't light the first house, maybe the second house isn't going to light either, and so you can stop the
Yeah.
travel.
I
um,
think on a slow-moving fire, yes, but on a wind-driven ember fire, the interior of the neighborhood is just as likely to be the source as what they used to call the first house.
that's right. Yeah. And it's intersectional with our landscapes too. Our native species landscape, I don't know, in the alpine plateau of BC, ponderosa pines are common. They're a common native tree species. They're also high ignition, burn fast, and burn hot. As you're renewing landscape, I don't think this is a world where we pave over everything. We're still human beings. We still are part of nature. But we might go for a deciduous variety instead of the conifers that are traditional, and which everyone likes. But if you can find a leafy, low ignition tree that does a similar job of shade and visual benefit to your landscape, then that might be the way to go too.
What would be
So,
some of those type of trees?
well, anything that's not a pine is a starting point, and then
Okay.
there's a variety of others, and we know as scouts, we go to put a pine twig, and it even makes a hissing sound as the the fuel inside. We even indigenous traditional knowledge will teach us, the birch bark canoe is kind of held together by that coniferous tree sap. We make it
Yeah.
into a resin. So that resin burns persistently and hot, and especially when you've got a really hot fire, it will burn fast and will burn hotter, and so there's an accelerant there. It's different than a deciduous, which will burn off its leaves and probably survive even to regrow.
Interesting. You used a term earlier that I hold synonymous with Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy.
Okay.
That it's an archaic, it's an Old English term, and I believe the words you used were fire season.
Yeah.
Do you still believe in fire season?
Yeah.
Uh,
Fire season is an interesting thing. So
given that the most destructive fires have been January and December fires.
well, so meteorologically, the world is changing and kind of quickly, and so that's true. And let's pay attention, because it's going to change again. It's not a
Yeah.
linear change. It's not necessarily atmospherically not a predictive linear change. Sea level rise is a little different because it comes up, and it's just a matter of time. So time is the point of elasticity. You can say, oh, well, when everything melts, when all the glaciers melt and everything melts, there's going to be more water in the ocean, and it's going to bring us a new ocean height of X, and that's discernible. We know that.
Everything below that height won't burn.
Well, okay, that's the intersection with wildfire. Wildfire is different. right? Wildfires,
Yeah.
the conditions of drought and invasive species, and all of these things that are changing, and part of the dynamics, plus the accelerating or changing patterns of wind, less predictability of the wind, combined with that hot ember carrying column of rising air that comes out of the fire. So all of those things are dynamic and changing. But what isn't changing is that we're going to have to put a new roof on, and we can put a steel roof on instead of a cedar roof, and we can reduce our risk of whenever and whyever those embers land on our property, reducing the probability of ignition. And that's with our biggest asset. So for sure, we wouldn't dig the gold out of the ground and not build a Fort Knox. We would, this is our Fort Knox at an individual level, all of us, and so why wouldn't we spend a little bit of our own preventative insurance money on upgrading that roof assembly, or when we're doing new siding, don't go vinyl, and make these better choices. And so I think that if we think of this as asset protection and asset investment, then it allows us to mobilize our own capital, our own autonomous decision making, and then to work with our neighbors who probably we like, and to do that at a community scale. And that's all just pure self-interest. There's no debate about, is climate change real? There's nothing about that. It's my biggest asset. It's my safe family. Let's do what we can while we're putting a new roof on, or putting new siding on, or building something new to make it the best, most resilient thing that it can be to the hazards, which may be intersectional. So we may be dealing with wildfire in some valley in BC that's also prone to flooding. So we think about both things and all the risks that are in any context, and we try to do the best things to protect our largest asset and our well-being. And in wildfire, and we talked early about the smoke.
Yeah.
So, you asked a question about wildfire season. Let's talk about that for a second. Wildfire season happens coincidentally with insurance renewal annually. So, in real estate, you can't really hold a mortgage unless you got insurance.
Right.
The bank won't give it to you. So, proof of insurance precedes mortgage availability. So, if you are renewing a mortgage in a wildfire context, and there's an active wildfire within, in Canada, 100 kilometers of your property, you might not be able to secure that insurance, and therefore you may not be able to get the lending. What does that have?
What happens when you've got the mortgage and now you lose the insurance?
Then
what do they do? Does the bank
lender
come
will
foreclose
suspend
on you, or what?
They'll suspend their follow through. So you'll have to push the deal. You'll have to find some bridge financing, or get your existing lender to extend what you've got, or something. You got to get very creative. And this is very acutely affecting new transactions in BC in particular, but everywhere. So if you're picking up a new mortgage, you and I go shopping for a house, you decide the Okanagan Valley is gorgeous and the wineries and everything. And so you're going to buy there. And then you call your insurance company the day before you're about to close, and you say, hey, can we start this tomorrow? Because that's when my mortgage comes in. And they say, no, there's an active wildfire. We can't insure you. So your deal then is in jeopardy, and the couple $100,000 that we've got down as a deposit is in the deal. So it's not accessible we can't pull it out. We can't renege on our commitment. And the seller,
it's a big deposit.
Yeah, it's a Canadian marketplace. We got
okay.
The prices here are insane, and also it's Canadian dollars, so it's not quite like the value of wisdom across the border. So what happens, and that's where I think you get into seasonality. I had a conversation with a treasurer, a treasurer at a condo board in BC. And they were renewing in an April timeframe for their insurance, and the insurer said, "Sorry, there's a active wildfire. We can't underwrite you right now." And so now you've got a 100-unit condo. That's 100, let's say, $1 million units that are owned by individuals that are suddenly unsellable and uninsured. Scary precarity.
So now this developer's tied up all this money.
It's not even a developer. Those are individual property owners just going for renewal on an existing condo corporation. It's 100 townhouses in BC. And so that treasurer shared with me that they watched carefully until the wildfire was out of distance, and then they called the insurer and they set the anniversary for insurance renewal to the lowest probability of fire date that they could find based on current information.
Okay.
And so that current information is dynamic, but that looks like a December renewal in Canada. And so, yes, things are changing. It's not really the season. The seasonality isn't predictable, just like the tornado alley is moving off of Kansas a bit. But the idea, I think, still gets it across the line, which is that there is a certain cycle that we're in. And
Sure.
as we have hotter, drier summers, we're going to get hotter wildfires and accelerated spread.
Hotter, drier, windier.
Yep.
So you kind of divided efforts there into things I could do that may have some material global impact on making things better, which we should do, right? And then things that I have really direct control over, like what my roof is made of and where the nearest trees are to my home and whether I have protected zone 0 or not, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So this is really an area where people can see the influence of their influence, right? Versus where it's more theoretical.
Right. And so that theoretical thing, I'm going to drive an EV and save the environment by lower emissions and all that sort of stuff. That's all important stuff. And it's laudable investments that you can make. But in protecting my asset looks like a real self-interested, start with me and the I, me, my, and the what you see is what you get. It's mostly WYSIWYG. It's not like you need to think about it too hard. Is the wood pile next to the house equals bad? Right. So how far they want 10 meters? Okay, that might not be possible. If it's not possible, make it 8. Make what's possible. Do it on the weekend, like this weekend, and clear the fuel away from your house. Right. Consider, how you're going to get that cedar that's beside the foundation. If you're in a high probability ignition place, try to, even though you hate the idea of not having the privacy that tree gives you, find a path that you can live with, and start planning now, and, just make one dent at a time until you get there. But involve your neighbors and talk about it, talk about it at the coffee shop and make it a community scale, because we together have a great deal to lose by, the tariffs are definitely going to mess both sides of our border economically. But when a community, loses businesses, loses houses, and, loses education and healthcare facilities, all these things, they cost society a lot to build back. And it's a lot better to keep everything, as is, preserved against those risks as much as possible. And I think that we're going to see the marketplace really value these kinds of investments over time. So I believe that there'll be some kind of community rating that is not dissimilar to the current fire rating we get for residential insurance, which is your proximity to a fire hydrant.
Right.
The strength of your fire department. Do they have enough trucks and folks to?
They measure the proximity to the fire hydrant, but they don't ask whether there's water in there.
Right. Hashtag what does Phoenix do about this problem?
Right.
In peak drought. So this is where we get to the intersections of all the things that are changing so fast in the environment, and that is that there is one node that we're talking about today, and that's wildfire, but they often intersect other points of risk. And so it is important to think beyond just that one angle.
Tell me about over your right shoulder. I see some artwork hanging in the background there.
These are the kids, making eco art. This is the under the ocean. I think this is like a fan coral,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So how old are your kids?
This is a little bit of a throwback. My partner's kid is just turned 16, and my kids are 16 and 19.
Okay, I've got a 19-year-old as well. So when we think about the kids and the world that they'll grow up in, like for me, that's a huge motivation as to why I work on what I'm working on. Because I used to love going out in the woods and go camping and this and that, and I think there's a reasonable chance that when my kids grow up, there won't be woods to take their kids camping in, right? That the landscape will be very, very different. How does that play in your life?
We're super backwoods eco people. Like I've done a 400-kilometer canoe trip where the road ends in northern Ontario out to James Bay, which is the bottom part of Hudson Bay, in the beginning of the Arctic Ocean, and in the north of Ontario. My kids have each traveled through the wilderness. They've done month-long trips with their peers, over the years. And what I've noticed just personally being out there is that there's a lot more wind events that are taking trees down. Those trees have been there for 150 or 200 years, and they're getting just knocked right over by these windstorms. Also microbursts, which are kind of like mini tornadoes, snapping trees off 30 feet off the ground, and maybe sometimes a stand of trees. And so I'm seeing that, along with what might have been in the past lush forest floor is now crispy, ignition-friendly ferns.
Yeah.
And so all of these things are observable, and I certainly have seen them. And in terms of the legacy for my kids, my 19-year-old is very frank. He said, "Dad, you look at these problems. It's not like you got your head in the sand. Why did you have me if you knew it was going to be like this? If you knew that the world that you were going to be handing to me was going to be shit, then why did you decide to have kids?" And he challenges me on those things, and he says, I can't access housing; it's too expensive. The job market is crap, and for millennials, and the environment is going down. Like, how am I supposed to get a compass to this world and find hope for myself in this context? And I think that that's a common experience, certainly among my son's cohort. My second son doesn't care as much. He's not as thoughtful, maybe, but the first one's really pressing me, and I don't think he's alone.
No.
We're having an election right now, and I'm listening to the CBC, which is Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and they're talking to millennials who say, these leadership debates, they're forgetting us. They're talking about, yesterday. They're not even talking about climate change anymore, and so they're feeling left out. I think it's one of our deepest responsibility is creating a condition for hope amongst generations and a pathway to it. And our individual actions, like what we do at home or how we conduct our lives, sets an example for those folks, for the kids, and gives them a condition that they can, maybe get on board with and believe that we didn't just pull the ladder up on these kids, right?
Yeah, right.
And so,
right. It's not that our generation and the one behind it, created a lot of problems that we're now going to pass to them. The least we could do is pass some of the solutions as well.
And if we're going to be, if some of the assets that we're going to be handing to our children as part of our legacy, it's not only what we did and the nice things that are said, at our funeral, it's also the idea that we are leaving with them, both the wisdom that we impart as well as the stuff that we leave with them.
Right.
Grandpa's gold watch, it's going to be yours. But is that stuff valuable? And it'd be more valuable if it's more resilient.
Yeah. Now, what's your birth rate doing? Because that might be the solution for your kids is, with scarcity of housing, well, a smaller population, there's less scarcity.
Yeah, so the smaller population challenge is probably not dissimilar to the population curve in the U.S., right? You've got an aging population. So you've got the boomers.
You mean the other 50 states? No.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Oh my God, the Great White North. So if your listeners really want to have a laugh, go to a place called Chili Beach on YouTube. People have called it
Chili.
North Park. It's Canada's 14th friendliest town. It's located on an iceberg, and the number of days since a polar bear attack are 0. So, anyways, good for a laugh and some poking fun at mostly Canadians, and occasionally Americans make a guest appearance where they come and try to invade and do stuff like that. But anyways, a good laugh. And there are, in a serious way, there are lots of resources that are available. So when I initially started this work, because there were no examinations of property value impact from cat loss in Canada, or very few. I went to the United States to sort of find aggregate literature that sort of demonstrated what was going on. And so this is not a new arena of thinking. There's a lot of thought and a lot of research, and there's already resources. So IBHS in the US has Fortified, great program. There's FireWise, also great program. In Canada, we've got FireSmart, which is a counterpart to FireWise, sort of, which gets at what to do at a lot level with sort of instructional how-tos, as well as what to do at a community scale with ways of engaging community and dialogue. Partners for Action at the University of Waterloo in Ontario have some great resources on tactically, here's what you do on the weekend to reduce your ignition. Tactically, here's what you do when you're doing a renovation to reduce your ignition. The Intact Center for Climate Change is also got some great resources for homeowners, as does the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. In the US markets, IBHS is the way to go. In Canada, you've got to get sort of your sources from. We're not as far along on the labeling and interventions as you folks are south of the border.
Is the difference between FireSmart and FireWise? FireSmart, you learn from your mistakes, and FireWise, you learn from the mistakes of others?
I guess. I don't know. I think it was probably what domain was available when they were trying to book a brand, but it's just a guess.
If they go in .ca, they should be able to, find anything they want.
Find anything they want. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Interesting. Yeah. So really happy to see that you maintain a sense of humor through this. And that's probably essential, because if you simply looked at the facts, it would be pretty depressing.
I think that, part of looking at this difficult topic is having a cry about how we messed it up, and then also being very sure of what you're going to do now. My 19-year-old is not going to let me off the hook at the dinner table, so I can't let myself off the hook for sure. So, right. That's the premise of my continued and ongoing caring about it, what happens in this arena. And I think it's a motivator for anybody, no matter where you are. But you do have to sort of look at the honest reality of the situation. It's very difficult to be good at adaptation if you can't be honest about what the situation is. And this situation is getting increasingly dire.
Sure. But no amount of your tears are going to fix it.
That's right. You can't rain hard enough, even if, rain isn't hard enough to put it out. So, those tears.
So action.
There's lots of.
Where does your 19-year-old fall on saying, well, maybe I didn't cause this problem, but I inherited it. So now it's my problem, and I will participate in the solution, versus, Dad, you did this, you fix it.
Yeah. I'd say that just like most people in society, in all societies in the world, they're concerned about eating, in paying rent, and having fun sometimes, before they're concerned about changing the world or making the world a better place. I also think that for him, it's probably a little bit powerless feeling that is reflecting from the conversations. Even though I don't think he would look at me and say, "You need to solve this, Dad." I think he has said to me, "I appreciate that you're trying to contribute to solving this," but I think he recognizes the very limited impact that an individual can have, and so. But I think he's more concerned with making enough money to pay rent, making enough money to he wants to go traveling next year, and I think, just like most people, this is not a top concern until it happens to you. And what I'm hoping that you do is get some members of the public to realize that it can happen to them, and that when they're doing that new roof, they could do something that's better, and they should.
Yeah. I hope they do. And my 19-year-old has the same concerns, right? Food and groceries and expenses, and and he looks to me to solve many of these problems.
Oh, sure, yeah,
which I'm happy to do to the degree I can.
Yeah, when I go to visit him, I always I stop at the butcher and grab a few things, and
oh, that's great.
And then his roommates,
and then his roommates tell you. So, what do you pick up at the butcher?
Usually local, whatever. My butcher is near in my neighborhood. I like that local economy thing. It's part of that whole solution, right? Food security begins at your local baker, butcher, and grocer. And so that's the way I do it. They've got some prepared foods. Like I actually did a course over there with Maria, who's 80, and she taught me how to make ravioli.
Wow.
Somebody's Nona, teaching me how to make ravioli in the back of the butcher shop. I mean, they're good people, and so that's the kind of stuff that I bring over to the kids' house. But
Do
I
you
spend
think?
those dollars in those local resources because it's part of that whole sense of sort of friend shoring, onshoring, keeping your local living economy alive. And that's another place where your everyday actions make a difference, right?
Sure. I mean, I
Part of
think
the resilience of our
I
community.
asked about the butcher because consuming less meats is a really great way to uh, positively impact the environment. Right?
Absolutely true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with a vegetarian friend of mine who's living in Nova Scotia. He has a business called Efficiency Properties where he promotes like energy scores as part of a listing process.
Oh,
But he's a vegetarian, and we were having this debate, and I said, "Yeah, I don't drive anywhere, and I eat meat, sometimes
I see.
less
So
than maybe
it's a
everybody, but
right.
yeah. So I'm choosing my actions in these ways, but I think everybody can contribute in the way that works for them.
Yep.
I would just say none of these things are isolated, right? They are all interconnected in subtle ways, um,
So
and the subtlety of those connections is what culminates, I think, into a secure society or quality of life.
where do you
Whereas
live that you don't drive anywhere?
I live in a neighborhood called Roncesvalles, which is actually where I grew up, and I was born at the local hospital here. I have moved and lived other places and came back here, but we had a very large Polish community. Pope John Paul came to visit here when I was a kid, in '88 or whatever. But there's only one franchise business along the whole retail strip of the main street. It's all independent businesses. Some have been around for 60 years, and some are new last week. But I almost exclusively spend my grocery money at those businesses, unless I need
And you
something.
walk to them. You
Yeah,
walk or bike ride, or how do you get
yeah,
around?
but walk or bike. Yeah,
Okay. So it's nice that you have a community where it's a walkable area.
yeah. I mean, in all my years of real estate, the benefits of this are incredibly good. There's a YouTube podcaster who does an incredible story on where the best rent value is in a walkable neighborhood in
Hmm.
America. And so you can actually see the top 20 places to live where the rent is not that bad, but you can still walk to all the things you need. And I think so I used to teach this investment in real estate course, and I would say, okay, do you want to invest in a depreciating asset or an appreciating asset? Because if you can eliminate a car from your life in Canada, driving a Honda Civic for an average commute day year round is going to cost you approximately $600 a month. That's insurance, car payment, and it could be a little bit more depending on but Civic is entry level car, right? So $600 a month. That $600 pays for $100,000 of borrowing. So if you can eliminate a car from your diet, you can actually get $100,000 more asset working for you. And so that's the way I think about time. Time
Okay.
is part of my asset accumulation. If I have to work, $10,000 more every year before I can make the payment on my house or to afford to have that car, these are the kinds of things that I try to think about and try to
Right.
share with others, because to me, that's where the quality of life intersects with the asset. So it's not only just asset to own it, and
Right.
it's also asset to live. Kind of like Henry David Thoreau taught, every American until last year, for all time, that the complication of home is entwined with mortgage, mort, death, a debt until you're dead. you know and so
Yeah.
if you're going to take one of those on, then do it in the most self-interested way possible. And so that's how I end up in a walkable location by choice. And
That's great.
yeah.
I wouldn't say I'm in a walkable location. I could walk anywhere, but I also don't drive. I just stay home.
Yeah, the most fuel efficient car is the one that's parked, and I'm with
Yeah,
you. I'm very much at home at the edge of the lake, in the deep wilderness, or at the cottage on the dock. We have a big cottage lifestyle thing here in Ontario, where lots of city idiots that flee to the country, to some McMansion on the water, as a weekend culture,
right.
cottaging culture. But I don't think anything is bad as long as it's for you, right?
Yeah,
If
right.
if you want to live by the lake, then live by the lake. That's okay. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying, but like you say, that driving every day all the time is probably not doing good things to your butt size, or your
Yeah,
or to your sense of well-being. Right?
right. And you look at LA. I get people like live half their life in commuting.
Yeah, and teleworking is helping,
Yeah.
but it's not
I
necessarily
mean, that's one of the good byproducts of COVID, right?
yeah, yeah, that accelerate. Although there's a return to office culture that's going on, and you know, commercial real estate assets have been suffering like crazy through this, right? And
Right.
so it's that. I mean, that's another system that's sort of in a dynamic state. Here we're seeing more and more conversation about how do you take those relatively underused square footage of those buildings and convert them into condos or
Into pickleball
co-housing or
courts.
something. Right? Yeah, anything. Yeah, community assets.
Right.
Public good assets as well as private assets, but take them out of their sort of stagnant, underutilized state. It's no different, I think, than the brownfield movement that started in the mid '90s. And continues, that reclaiming those spaces really is part of this transition to this preferred future.
Well, I wonder when, I'd like to see your mind map of all of the different areas of, I was going to say areas of difficulty, but I'll rephrase them as areas of opportunity.
Yeah, and they often go hand in hand, right? You're
Yeah.
solving a problem with an opportunity, and yeah, it's vast. The dynamic state of change is accelerating. I think that the challenge for us, for society, is keeping up with the pace of acceleration. Right? It's just like a race right now. The rate of destruction from wildfire is outpacing by an order of magnitude our adaptive response to it. And so we need to take this question of risk reduction quite seriously, and do it for all of the self-interested reasons that we do everything. Before we go and volunteer in our community, we definitely take care of ourselves, feed our kids, and then go, do our interacting with others. And I think feeding our kids involves putting a steel roof on. Feeding our kids involves, a low ignition property. And it's the journey of 1,000 steps, right? You do have to. There are a lot of steps to take. Start with the wood pile and move it off the foundation wall, and then go from there. And eventually, 52 weekends from now, you'll be set. Or one roof renewal, from now, you'll be set because you'll have done all the little things on the way.
Right. Maybe get rid of the wood pile altogether.
Yeah, I mean,
Switch to solar. Right.
when one of the things you ask my kids a lot, one of the things that I remember sitting there with my kid when he was 7 with Levi, and he was drawing a picture of a house, and I said, "Where's the chimney?" And he said, "Dad, this house runs with the sun. Can't you see the solar panels?" So
Wow.
it's possible, right?
Yeah.
Like that is where we're going. Get rid of the wood pile. Although I will say this from a biophilic design perspective, fire has been part of human beings' experience of the world for 10,000 years plus. It's baked into our genetic culture, right? That there's
When the world population was about 2% of what it is now.
Yeah, right. But still, we
Right.
have that inherent,
Yeah.
physiological response to the fire, the safe fire inside the box,
Right.
in our houses being sort of the heart of the home, the hearth of the home, and a place to gather and socialize. And I think that all is all present.
That is
And
not going
so
away. Yeah.
it's not going to go away, but maybe we can do it with a beeswax candle or something like that as as a transition idea.
Bob Shanks wrote a book called The Cool Fire, and it was that the television has replaced fireplace.
Yeah, I saw a New Yorker cartoon a few years ago that was like that. It was a caveman looking at a computer with a fire going on it, like many living rooms experience at Christmas time.
Right. I think they also did a cartoon that television is proof that people will look at anything rather than each other.
That's funny.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, it's been a great hour with you here. Really enjoy
I really
learning
appreciate you
from
reaching out. It's really nice to see you again and to chat with you. And I'll send you links to all the things we talked about.
Great. I'll post them.
When I get that mind map over the finish line and it looks like shareable, then I'll be sure to send that to you in case it's another reason to reconnect.
Well, I think there's more than a dozen factors in here, and in houses and mortgage and the economy and the environment and like so many things intersecting here. That would be a nice map to share with your kids. Well, really, like if we think of this problem as intergenerational, not only in the fact that like we're leaving them a problem, but that the problem is so complex that it's not likely to be solved within a generation. And so we're using the stand on the shoulders concept here, right? I've looked at the problem. Here's how far I've gotten it. I give this to you, and you make the next advances in it.
Right.
And maybe generations down the road, we'll be looking at something close to a workable solution.
And it's a much better way to go than just leaving it out there for them to solve by themselves, right? Without any, thinking.
With no direction.
Yeah. Well, I think I'll take that as a call to action to a little fire under me to get to work on that output. And so thanks for the call to action. I value it,
You bet. I look forward to looking at it and putting my own notes on it as well.
Outstanding. Well, great to talk to you today, Steve.
Chris Chopik joining us from Toronto. Thank you so much for sharing what you've shared with us today. And I know you've got more. And we look forward to posting your roadmap to future success for new generations. I'm Steve Wolf. You've been listening to The Fire Break. Thanks for joining us here. We're sponsored by Team Wildfire. Till next time, be careful, be safe, and move the woodpile.